When we left off, we were talking about the Viet Cong tunnel complex at Cu Chi and how hundreds of miles of tunnels existed underground, allowing the Viet Cong to use guerrilla war tactics and literally disappear into the jungle. The United States soldiers, it took a long time for us to figure out that this existed. You can see from this diagram that these were complex tunnels with all sorts of things going on underground. Adding to the Viet Cong's elusiveness was a network of really elaborate tunnels that allowed them to withstand airstrikes, to launch surprise attacks, and disappear quickly. It connected villages throughout the countryside. The tunnels became home to many guerrilla fighters. One Viet Cong soldier said, "The more the Americans tried to drive us away from our land, the more we burrowed into it." Vietnam's jungles and rice paddies not only dealt sweltering heat and leeches, but also you had to be cautious at every step. There were landmines. They had taken American landmines, dismantled them, moved them after they'd been mapped, and rigged them with triggers so that our maps for getting through the places that even we landmined were no good. So this made for a difficult situation for American soldiers. We're going to have to move kind of quickly today. So away we go, and I apologize for that. Another key part of American strategy was to keep the Viet Cong from winning the support of South Vietnam's rural population. In order to do that, they wanted to expose how the enemy was working. So the United States from above was trying to expose the way that the enemy was moving. They used weapons for exposing tunnels that included explosions, and they also used Agent Orange, a leaf-killing toxic chemical, as a defoliant to spray from above over top of the jungle. Between the napalm and the Agent Orange, the United States targeted, unfortunately, well, in some cases purposefully and oftentimes unintentionally, a civilian population that was absolutely devastated by these types of weapons. General Westmoreland would later say the United States never lost a battle in Vietnam, but whether or not the general's words were true, they underscored the degree to which the Americans misunderstood the enemy. The United States views the war strictly as a military struggle, and Viet Cong saw it as a matter of survival. And when you are destroying the very land and the very home and the civilian population in which people live, it's pretty hard to win over their heart and their mind. This is not a very good map, but it shows the areas that were targeted particularly by the Agent Orange. This is just the South Vietnamese side of the peninsula. And so all of this red area, these are the areas the United States was sent to support. This whole part of the country was supposed to be the area the United States was supporting. So imagine what North Vietnam looked like. Now, in addition to that, the Agent Orange was a chemical, like we already talked about, a chemical defoliant, and it genetically mutated the bodies of people. It contaminated the water supply, it contaminated the rice supply, which was the primary food source, the staple food source of the Vietnamese people and all the Southeast Asian people, and it led to birth defects in the next generation. These are some of the birth defects that you see in this image. It's kind of tough to look at. The worst of the birth defects that I saw, I didn't show because it was too horrible for me. And then the United States became really desperate and frustrated and decided that they were going to go village to village and seek out the Viet Cong. And so they came up with something called search and destroy missions. The U.S. soldiers conducted search and destroy missions, uprooting civilians with suspected ties to the Viet Cong, killing their livestock, burning villages. Many villagers then fled to cities or refugee camps, creating by 1967 more than 3 million refugees in just the south part of Vietnam. The irony of the strategy was summed up in February 1968 by a U.S. major whose forces had just leveled the town of Bon Tre. We had destroyed the town in order to save it. Okay. These are some of the effects of things like napalm. Napalm is like a liquid jelly. that can be ignited. So it's kind of like Vaseline dropping from the sky and then being ignited. And the downside to that is that you can't just brush it off. You can't wash it off very easily. This famous photograph came from the napalming of a village. This is Kim Phuc. She's in the center of that photograph and actually wrote a book. Okay, last section for the year 1968. The year 1968 began with a daring surprise attack by the Viet Cong on numerous cities in South Vietnam, and this was referred to as the Tet Offensive. The simultaneous strikes, while ending in military defeat for the communist guerrillas, stunned the American public, who had been told that the Viet Cong were on the verge of giving up. Many people with moderate views now began to turn against the war. So, January 30th was the Vietnamese equivalent to New Year's Eve. It was the beginning of the Lunar New Year festivities, known in Vietnam as Tet. Throughout the day in 1968, villagers taking advantage of week-long truce proclaimed for Tet streamed into cities across South Vietnam to celebrate the New Year. At the same time, many funerals were being held for victims of the war. Accompanying the funerals were the traditional firecrackers, flutes, and of course coffins. But the coffins in this case contained weapons, and many of the villagers were Viet Cong agents, and that night the Viet Cong launched an overwhelming attack on over 100 towns and cities in South Vietnam, as well as 12 U.S. air bases. The Tet Offensive continued for about a month before the United States and the South Vietnamese forces were able to regain control of the cities. General Westmoreland declared the attacks an overwhelming defeat for the Viet Cong. From a purely military standpoint, Westmoreland was right. The Viet Cong lost about 32,000 soldiers in the month-long battle, while the ARVN and the Americans lost about 3,000. However, from a psychological standpoint, the Tet Offensive greatly shook the American public, which had been told repeatedly and had come to believe that the enemy was almost defeated. So these are the types of coffins that would be used in Vietnam. I took a picture of those. This is the type of a vehicle that has the processional with the coffin in the back, so you can see how it's a little bit different. And these would go like really super slow through the streets, and everybody would be following along really slowly, which would have given an opportunity for weapons and people to be hidden inside. In a matter of weeks, the Tet Offensive changed millions of minds about the war. Despite the wars of anti-war protest, a poll taken just before Tet showed that about 28% of Americans called themselves doves, which meant they wanted peace, and 56% claimed to be hawks, which meant they supported war. But after Tet, both sides tallied about 40%. The mainstream media, which had reported the war in a skeptical but generally balanced way, now openly criticized the war. One of the nation's most respected journalists, Walter Cronkite, told his viewers that it now seemed more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam would end in a stalemate. At this point, Robert MacNamara, who you read about last week, decides to quit. He feels like he cannot any longer continue in the position of Secretary of Defense because he feels like the war is unwinnable. So LBJ accepts his resignation and appoints a brand new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford takes a look at all of the records that exist, trying to catch himself up for his new job, and he decides the war is unwinnable. Can you imagine if your Secretary of Defense believes publicly that you cannot win the war? What kind of message that sends to the American people?
At the end of January 1968, Saigon was alive with a festive spirit as everyone prepared for the Tet Lunar New Year. This was to be the first spring of the Second Republic of Vietnam. The Tet truce, proposed by the communist North Vietnamese, seemed to promise the people a safe holiday, free from the ever-present anxiety of war. At the temples, the people gathered to pay respect to their ancestors. On the eve of the new year, thousands of Saigon families prayed before the altars of their ancestors. They prayed that peace might be restored to their homeland. This year, however, the traditional firecrackers of the Tet celebration became the fireworks of war. The Viet Cong, taking advantage of the noisy celebration, launched a savage attack on Saigon, violating the truce they themselves had proposed. Areas of the city became a blazing inferno. Columns of smoke rose skywards as block after block in the capital city burned with the fires of Viet Cong treachery. As the frightened people fled, many fell victim to the enemy gunfire. Carefully planned attack by the North Vietnamese has been described as their all-or-nothing, go-for-broke effort. It ended in 10 communists dead for each Allied soldier lost, the tremendous price they paid for their desperate attempt. When the fire subsided, the residents returned into the ashes of their homes and sadly shuffled through the ruins to salvage what they could. Many of these people had been born in these houses and had reared their children in them. Now there was nothing left but ashes and memories.
The growing division over Vietnam led to a shocking political development in the spring of 1968, a season in which the Americans also endured 2 assassinations, a series of urban riots, and a surge in college campus protests. So 1968 was a rough year. Well before the Tet Offensive, an anti-war coalition within the Democrats Party had sought a Democratic candidate to challenge Johnson in 1968. He was becoming more unpopular, and so they did something unusual, which was to push for another candidate. Usually you go with the incumbent, so that means that he was a Democrat, and he could have run for election again. He's more likely to get elected than his opponent, statistically, historically, yet he is so unpopular that the Democrats decide to put somebody up against him. So they have a couple of candidates. Eugene McCarthy runs for the Democratic nomination as a complete dub, a complete person opposed to the war. But as LBJ's numbers don't look so hot, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, which is John F. Kennedy's little brother, who had been Attorney General under the Kennedy administration, decides he's going to throw his hat in the ring. Robert Kennedy ends up extremely popular, and when LBJ finds out about this, sees Robert Kennedy's solid numbers, LBJ decides he just is done. He can't do this anymore, and he says he's not going to seek re-election, so he's bowing out of the race. Highly unusual. Martin Luther King ends up assassinated in April of 1968, and that is a moment when these urban riots go crazy, and people are frustrated by the situation. They're angry. It's a lot like today with regards to civil rights protests. Kennedy, who happened to be a decent friend of Martin Luther King Jr., came out publicly. He was actually campaigning when he found out that Martin Luther King had been shot. His advisors told him, do not mention it. The city will go crazy. They don't know yet. And Kennedy decided instead to speak eloquently about Kennedy's assassination and deal with race right there on the spot. And it was one of the only places, only major cities, that did not see major urban riots. Kennedy, however, is short-lived. A guy named Sirhan Sirhan kills him before he's able to run for president of the United States. Vietnam and civil rights unrest, and these things come together, and college campuses explode in violence. 1,200 college campuses are shut down for the year, and all the kids are sent home. And in the midst of all of this, Richard Nixon, who is a Republican, is running for president. He promises law and order, and he is elected and begins the de-escalation of Vietnam and the pull out of U.S. soldiers out of Vietnam. We'll walk away from the whole situation.